Today we're going to talk about ethnocentrism and cultural relativity. And this is stemming back from some of our earlier discussions on the components of culture as we talked about our beliefs, values, and norms. And as we move into ethnocentrism, this is the view that your culture is superior to other cultures. It is a way that we pass judgment of what is correct and incorrect ways of behaving. So if we think about some of the norms we might have within the United States for our behavior, sometimes when we go traveling into other countries, we might find that we're offended because we're not seeing or expecting to see some types of behaviors as we travel. And let me give you an example of this. When we were traveling to Barbados, we have some friends that run the wildlife reserve in Barbados, and they are what would be referred to as very important people in Barbados. So their social class is a little bit higher than most people in Barbados. And because they're very important people and have that higher class standing, they hire domestic help. So they have somebody that does their cooking and cleaning and child care, and that person just comes in. And when we were down there visiting, we were having dinner one evening, and one of the things that we like to cook, and they remember when my husband was younger and they were in college together, that they wanted to try some meat pies. And so I wrote down the recipe for the meat pies, and then traditionally in our family, when we create these meat pies, we have everybody involved in the process. So when I go into the kitchen and I want to help, of course, the person that's in charge of the cooking and the cleaning and the child care doesn't want me to be helping. And so then it gets frustrated to me because I was expecting to be able to help in the cooking of the food. So now I didn't judge that as an incorrect way of behaving because I was certainly aware of my own ethnocentric viewpoints in terms of how cooking should be done or not done. But a lot of people have a real distinction that's made in terms of who can do what and when and where. And this is all resulting from our norms and our roles as we occupy particular statuses. Now, ethnocentrism obviously can be good for a particular culture and a particular society because this is our way of making certain that we have social order and it isn't chaotic as we come into interact with other people within the same culture. So when we have rules within the United States about what side of the road we're driving on or how people are to behave towards other people in terms of respect or disrespect, it's very important for us to realize that what our culture is actually doing is providing us with a rule book and getting every single one of us on that same page. So as we're looking at that rule book and we're asking, well, is this person on the same page as I am, then we're making those judgments. But again, when we think about ethnocentrism, what we're doing is we're saying that this way of doing things is the best way of doing things, and there are no other ways to do things. Another area that we could look at in terms of this is our ideas of when we look at marriage and who should be able to get married. Here in the United States, it is assumed that we are going to have just one partner. We're going to have a monogamous relationship, and we're not going to have affairs, and we're going to be married to one and only one person. And when we start thinking about other ways that people marry around the world, we find that there are some cultures that accept polygamous relationships, or where a person can be married to more than one person, whether it be polygyny, which is a man being married to more than one wife, or polyandry, where a woman can be married to more than one husband. And when we think about that, most of us cannot understand how a woman could be married and have multiple wives. We find that even sometimes with the Mormons, some of the fundamentalist Mormons that we have, where they are engaged in polygamy and trying to understand how those women can interact successfully with one another without being jealous and so on and so forth. So when we begin to make judgments that that is a incorrect way of behaving by having polygamous relationships, then we are really passing judgment. But we're also providing that with us in the United States by saying, well, this is the correct way that we behave, and it is superior to other cultures. And so it's basically giving us a lot of social order by making certain that we're all on the same page in terms of how we're supposed to behave. And it reduces the conflict that we have amongst each other within a particular culture. Unfortunately, the downside of ethnocentrism is that it actually shuts you off to new experiences. Because once you start saying, well, that's not the correct way of behaving, then you are not going to try that behavior. And I think my favorite example of this is when we think about food. And when we look at Americans, people from the United States anyway, we find that we are very what's referred to as food phobic. In other words, we have our particular foods that we like to eat, and we don't want to think about eating other types of food. So if I offered you a guinea pig, for example, probably your gut reaction would be to say, ew. And when you try it, you'd probably find out that it probably tastes a little bit like chicken. Doesn't everything taste like chicken, I think? And so when you're saying no to different new experiences, you really don't necessarily learn about that other culture. If you've made that judgment already, then you cannot really get to an understanding of why that culture might have adopted that particular cultural practice as it adapted to its environment. And if we look around the world, obviously we don't find cattle everywhere, we don't find pigs everywhere. And so there's other food that people eat, and when we turn ourselves off, then we might find that we're truly missing something in terms of understanding other cultures. So the other thing about ethnocentrism that is pretty negative is that it is the basis of intergroup hatred and violence. And when we begin to think about ethnocentrism, and if we go back to examples of 9/11 and some of the fundamentalist Islamic groups that are a little bit more dealing with terror, we find that they do have that intergroup hatred. And we do see the violence exhibited from these groups that think that their culture is superior to other cultures. And we can even see that even within some groups within the United States, like the KKK, would be an example where they're very ethnocentric in terms of the way they think the world should be. And it does create hatred and violence with other groups because we're making that judgment that their way of doing things are incorrect, and therefore we have to inform them in some capacity that our ways are the ways that we should do it. And we see this a lot of times. If anybody's read Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible, it was really about ethnocentrism, where this family and missionary goes over to Africa and they bring with them a whole toolbox of ideas on how farming should be done, but they're using it based on their own experiences in Georgia rather than adapting to the new environment of Africa and the special circumstances that might have been involved in that. So we have to remember that when we are traveling, we don't want to take a ethnocentric view that our culture is superior to the other culture, because it will actually shut us off to truly understanding the cultural practices of other countries and accepting those practices and not getting angry because they are not behaving as we expect them to. And so observation becomes really important as you are traveling, and if you can get over that initial, ooh, how can they do that reaction, then you might learn a little bit more about their culture and why they might pick up that cultural practice. If you haven't reviewed any of the Taboo series, you might want to pick up one of those, and I like the one on food because I think that sort of exhibits our ethnocentric view. I think that series talks about one culture that eats a lot of snakes, and I think the one that impacted me most was a South African or an African tribe that ate dog. And what was interesting about that culture was that they raised the dog to a particular age. They named the dog. I think the dog in the series is called Patience. And after Patience got to be a particular age, they cooked the dog and ate it. Now, we say, ooh, and why would they ever do that and create a pet? And then they ate their pets. And the reason that they did that is because they respect the characteristics of the dog, and in their culture they believe by eating that dog they are ingesting those characteristics. And we saw that probably in more earlier societies where we had cannibalism, where people would eat those that they killed because they might have had particular characteristics that they wanted to have within their own system. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. If we can get past that, oh my gosh, how can they do that? Then we can move forward. Another example of ethnocentrism, if we look at our language and how we're using our language, if we think about the term female genital mutilation, that is a very biased term in terms of looking at female circumcision. And a lot of times we don't think about, we're making judgments and that being incorrect. But if we don't understand, if we don't take a step back and look at the reason that culture might have adopted that practice, then we're never going to be able to figure out a way to make that better if we think that that's necessary. So even when we think about some of the things that we do in the United States, we have the female genital mutilation and we have female circumcision, but we have a lot of people that do that themselves, right? When we have piercings, nice piercings in places that I can't even imagine being pierced. And we also have our males that are circumcised as they are born, and they get circumcised, and I think that's a form of male genital mutilation in and of itself. And I guess they're lucky that they're so small that they don't have a real good recollection of that process being done. So we have to be real careful, and there's particular reasons why a practice might have been adopted by a particular culture. And my guess would be with the female genital mutilation or the female circumcision, part of the process and part of the reasons that occurred was because it was a form of birth control. We have to be able to restrict our population growth in some capacity, and that might have been a mechanism by which they controlled their population. As time moved on and the culture became more advanced, some of that then got wrapped up into religious beliefs in terms of the female. If we didn't do that to the female, then she would be wild and all she wants is sex all the time. So we have to curb that sexual appetite of the female. And so then it gets involved with the religious beliefs of a particular culture. Some of Marv Harris's work, he's an anthropologist too, he talks a lot about those different ideas and cultural practices and maybe where they first began in terms of particular society adapting to their environment. The classic that a lot of people read is on India's sacred cow and why the cow is sacred in India. And so when you think about people from India who are Hindu and they come to the United States and you want to serve them beef, they're probably going to have the same reaction as you do as when you think about eating guinea pig. So we have to remember that ethnocentrism is present in all societies and people have their own ideas about how we do things. But remember, it's going to shut us off to new experiences and it can lead to hatred and violence in its extreme form. And so as you're thinking about global community in this class, what I want you to do is think in terms of more cultural relativity. And by that I mean that a particular cultural difference is merely different and not better or worse than something else. And this is really assisting us in learning how different societies operate. It doesn't mean that we have to go and practice, or if you really don't want to eat guinea pig, you don't have to go and eat guinea pig. You might have to find some fruit or some other foods that you're going to be eating, but you don't have to necessarily participate in the practice, but to recognize that each and every society, as we think about the functions of that society, have different ways to do the same thing, whether it be the food that we eat or the shelter that we build. There are differences in the way that we accomplish these things. And if we take a step back, then we can really learn how the different societies are operating. So cultural relativity is really a form of open-mindedness and stepping back away from your initial reaction and asking yourself, well, why might they be doing it this way rather than the way that we actually do it here in the United States? So I want you to consider that as we move forward in terms of exploring differences, and especially as you get ready.